Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to Course Correction, Getting Farmers Branch Creek Back Under Control. I'm here with the Stormwater Design Team at Freeze & Nichols. I'm here with David Rivera, who helped with the modeling, Scott Hubley, that helped out with the design, and Stephen Nowhere, that was the professional geomorphologist on the design, and myself, Keith Byrne. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to go over here in this presentation today. We're going to start out with the drivers and motivations for geomorphology and why is it useful. So we have issues. Why do we have these issues? How can we determine these issues? Then we're going to get into some introduction concepts for geomorphology, and then we're going to do a few examples, or show you a few examples rather, of what does urban stability look like? A stream in the urban setting, how is that stable? How do we determine that's stable? Typically when we see stable streams, they're in very beautiful located sections of the world and not necessarily in a downtown or a very urban sprawled area. After that, we're going to jump into a case study in Farmers Branch, which was a dam failure that occurred, and there was some erosion and head cutting that migrated its way upstream, threatening other infrastructure. Now, this is going to be a pre-recorded section that is just going to talk about the modeling and the design, the emergency repair. But what we're going to do is we're going to take that case study and we're going to reevaluate it from a geomorphic bent. How did geomorphology play a role in aiding in the design of this particular case? So the drivers and motivators here. So there's a lot of infrastructure near streams. Some are exposed, some utilities are exposed, and some are exposed not on purpose. So when issues arise, if we can really understand the cause, maybe or hopefully that will help us protect the utility in the future, and we can also apply it to new designs. And that is exactly what geomorphology does for us. It gives us an understanding of a dynamic stream, a dynamic system such as a stream, which we can use to help design. So look at this first picture. Pretty an unstable utility here. Now, thank goodness that the seam in this particular sewer line was welded, because if the seam had been exposed here, it might have been worse. But there's a sag here and we're missing the bank. Why are we missing the bank? Why is the entirety of the line from, say, manhole to manhole not exposed? Why is this only select section exposed? Here's another utility crossing as an example. The initial design provided protection from the stream. However, the protection it provided was based on the stream size whenever it was constructed. There's really good intentions here. They've provided riprap. They've provided structural stability, piers. The design was really textbook in the grand scheme of things, but the stream had other thoughts here. Here's another example. It's hard to believe, but this concrete flume that you see here was actually a pilot channel placed in the center of a pretty wide floodplain. What happened? Look, notice the manhole and the sewer lines are completely exposed, and the flume looks like it's been buckled. What and why? These last utility failures were brought to you by stream instabilities. All good designs, but even the best designs, are no match if they don't account for the evolution of a stream, the geomorphology of a stream. I'm going to hand over the presentation to Stephen here, and he's going to explain geomorphology in more detail. It's not the intent for you to be an expert in an hour here, but rather learn how geomorphology may be able to help you in the future.
All right, thanks, Keith. As he mentioned earlier, I'm Stephen Norrell, and I'm a geomorphologist with Freeze & Nichols, and I'm going to be going through a couple of geomorphology concepts that we use to inform design and prevent erosion. So you might have seen a fluvial geomorphology talk before. Just go over it real quick. What is fluvial geomorphology? Well, it is how rivers change over time. That's the textbook definition. Fluvial meaning river, geomorphology meaning changing of the earth. And so these changes happen over different time scales. We can think of the geologic time scale as like thousands of years. Think about like the Grand Canyon being formed and global sea level rising and falling. Then you have, paleo, which is 1,000 years. Historic, you can think of like historic changes being like when the settlers came to Texas and agriculture started, and how did that landscape change affect our rivers? And then going to the more recent times, we have engineering timescales, like how is putting in a subdevelopment or a drainage network going to affect streams and rivers and erosion? And then the shortest one being events. Hurricane Katrina comes in and completely blows out your stream and erosion, and that happens all at once in an event-driven process. So, what is fluvial geomorphology? Well, usually for me in a civil engineering context, it's how do I fix my erosion problems? But really with our designs and going into the future, it should be how do I future-proof my designs by considering what's going to happen and what's going to change in the landscape. So as you may know, rivers change over time, and they sort of happen, it can happen naturally, so you have slow changes, but even those slow changes can add up given enough time. Take a look at these two pictures of the Trinity River from 1970 and 2015. The Trinity River is relatively stable, but these meander bends are still moving all over the place, and we don't really notice it from day to day, but as soon as it backs up to something of infrastructure, something of importance, it's a real problem. But really what we're going to be talking about today is in the urban landscape, how does urbanization and adding of infrastructure lead to streams that are not in equilibrium and that are not stable? And that brings us to the drivers of these instabilities. And, as I alluded to, urbanization and infrastructure is really what's leading to our watersheds being changed because of changes in hydrology. You think about put in a new development and add drainage infrastructure, and the hydrograph and how much water is making it to the streams is going to be altered. With the adding of all the impervious surface, we don't have water permeating into the ground, so more water is actually reaching the stream. It's reaching it more quickly because of concrete. The roughness of that ground is faster, and it's great that we have a whole discipline of stormwater engineers that are preventing flooding from flooding out our infrastructure. But ultimately, it's not the big 100-year event that always does the work. Sometimes it's the 2-year or the 5-year. If we were taking a football metaphor to this, that 100-year event is like throwing a Hail Mary. It works sometimes, and boom, you've got a lot of erosion. But those 2- and 5-year events, 1-year events, are really what's doing the work and moving the football down the field. Those are like the running plays. So it doesn't always, it doesn't take a geomorphologist to tell you when a dam's going to fail, but it might take one to say, hey, in 15 years time, all this urbanization is going to take out your dam. So really today we're going to be looking at reach scale or watershed level geomorphology, and how that actually might play a role and an impact even on like projects as small as like a single sewer line crossing. How that system's changing is going to affect that if the system is not in equilibrium. So we're going to talk about two concepts today, and just real quick, and then we'll get into some real examples. The first concept is lanes relationship or lanes balance, and this really what it says is that sediment, discharge or flow, and then the stream slope are all relational. So if you change one of those things, the others are going to adjust accordingly. So cause and effect. So to go through a situation here real quick, say you have your watershed system, and then you put in a new development, and there's now an increase in discharge. So on the right side of this balance, it gets heavier. There's an increase in discharge. You can see the arrow in the middle is now pointing to erosion, and that's because that increase in discharge, the slope is going to want to adjust to accommodate for that change in discharge. That increase in discharge can be from channelization or a myriad of other things. Another example of when you might get erosion and this balance is going to change is say that you have a stream and then they install a low head dam or a weir, and now sediment is getting trapped behind that weir. You're taking the sediment out of the system, so that left side of the balance is going to get lighter, and then you're going to get erosion because the water downstream of that weir is now no longer carrying sediment, so there's excess energy in the water, and it's going to become clear water conditions, and sometimes we call it hungry water because it's looking for something to pick up. And you'll get erosion occurring. On the other side, when might you get sedimentation? Well, say that you have your main branch of a channel or a stream or river, but then one of the tributaries that comes in now has a dam behind it and it's backing up water. Now there's less discharge in the system. There's less energy being able to carry that sediment load, and so therefore it's going to drop out and aggregate on the bottom of your stream, and then that can cause all sorts of problems too. For example, if you get a big old sediment pile in a culvert or something, and then it backs up, and then you actually end up with flooding problems, even though the whole reason of putting in that dam on that tributary was to prevent flooding problems. So thinking about these things ahead of time are going to allow us to think into the future. So that was the first concept, lanes balance, and that's telling us what is going to cause changes to the system. And now we're going to look at the second concept, which is the channel evolution model, and that's going to tell us how those changes actually happen. And we're going to be focusing on erosion here because that's the thing that we witness most often in urban settings. So you might have seen this photo before. It's the channel evolution model. There's a bunch of different variations of it. Sometimes they have 5 channel types. Sometimes they have 4, whatever. But what this is saying is how erosion is going to propagate through a watershed. So it all starts at a base level. So ultimately, base level is the ocean, but in our urban settings, that usually is a road crossing or a culvert or something. And that's a hard point that locks the stream slope in place. And so, add a bunch of discharge to your system. What happens is your stream starts to adjust, and in this first channel, that's like preconditions, nothing's occurred yet, system's in balance. Make a change, type 2 there on the diagram. Down cutting occurs, that's the first step. It's going to happen. So down cutting can occur through what's called nick point migration or a head cut, and that starts at your base level and then migrates upstream through your watershed. And then once the stream banks are so steep and deep that they can't support themselves, then you're going to have widening, so down cutting, then widening, and then eventually aggradation is going to occur, and then finally the stream will get back to a balance point, and there'll be a new channel within the banks of the previous channel. So it'll down cut to a point where you now have a new floodplain bench. And looking at this in profile on the bottom of that diagram there, you can actually see it going through, propagating through the watershed. So you can actually look at the channel morphology and see where you are within this channel evolution model, and it's going to tell you, what's going to happen in the future and what happened in the past. So we can use that to help us design our infrastructure in a way that we're counting for future changes. All right, so now that all the textbook mumbo jumbo is out of the way, I'm going to go through a couple of pictures and examples of locations that we saw on site where we can actually walk through this. So in this overhead picture here, this is a stream that was recently, the headwater or the upstream has recently been developed. There's a new suburban community up there. And so the first picture on the top right here, that's like the preconditions. Type 1, it says type 1 channelized, but that's a channel that hasn't adjusted yet, hasn't yet been impacted. And then, you walk 15 feet down the road and you can see in that second photo, it's now down cutting, and that's a head cut propagating upstream. And then in the third photo, this is even further downstream, it's down cut to a point where now the channel is widening, and that widening actually has the potential to impact this detention basin here. And so we've gone from type 1 to type 2, type 3. Now I'm looking at this again. We have this stream that looks really stable in this top photo. Like, that looks great. It's a great floodplain in an urban system. But then you just walk just downstream and you can see that head cut coming for it. And so once that head cut migrates through, it actually could impact that road there that's running parallel to the stream. Looking a little bit further down, so you can see that the bottom right photo is a culvert crossing. Now that's a hard point, that's the base level, and then you just go immediately upstream and you see it stable, so that would be a type 5 channel. It's already downcut and widened because that base level is so close. But if you continue upstream a little bit further, in that top photo, that's where we see that head cut. So right around that area, you have downstream of that, or that nick point is migrating upstream, and you have degradation right there. And then not just another example of that, so you can see the photos a little bit closer. The top photo is upstream, and we can see, that really steep bank that's going to be widening, but go downstream just a little bit further, and now it's stable, and we see that bank has been laid back, and it's done all the erosion it's going to do, and we have a stable channel just downstream of that. So knowing where you are in the watershed and looking upstream and downstream is going to inform your decisions about what is going to happen in your channel. All right, now we're going to transition to a presentation that was originally recorded for the TFMA 2020 Virtual Summit. This is where David and Scott are going to tell you about an emergency dam repair design in Farmers Branch. There was a dam failure in October 2020, and they're going to go through what was done to remedy that. And then once that presentation is done, Keith's going to come back and talk about how geomorphology was used to inform that design.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last presentation of the day for TFMA's Virtual Technical Summit. My name is David Rivera, and I'm teamed up today with Mr. Scott Hubly to share with you the story of the Farmers Branch Creek emergency repairs. I will be giving you most of the background story and showing you the sequence of events that led to this emergency repairs project. Then Scott is going to jump in and give you the details on the design and construction process. And then I will close with some of the potential next steps that are still pending for the project. Let me start off by introducing the project team. First of all, I want to acknowledge the Farmers Branch City Council. The council members were actively involved in the process and provided support, communicating with the public and managing expectations, which was really critical in this process. They also acted quickly to release the emergency funds that were needed for the project. The city manager, Mr. Charles Cox, and the director of public works, Mr. Mark Bentley, were both intimately involved managing the emergency, providing direction to the technical team as we were considering alternatives for the project. And Mr. Bentley was really the leader of this effort. He consistently visited the site. He had direct communication with the affected residents. He was actively involved in the design process as well. Then we have our Fries and Nichols design team. The team was led by Scott Hubly, and I serve as a project manager with Mark Shire as the design technical lead. He was supported by Cody Jones, also another of our engineers. We also had Mr. Micah Hargrave as our geotech engineer. One important thing to notice is that several of our Fries and Nichols senior engineers also visited the site and provided their expert advice during this design process. Finally, we have our contractor, DCI Contracting, under the leadership of Mr. Greg Sherman. DCI provided exceptional channel work experience and mobilized very quickly to build the improvements that you're about to see in this presentation. So our project site is in the city of Farmers Branch. Farmers Branch is located in the DFW Metroplex area, northwest of the city of Dallas, as you can see in this map. Zooming in to our watershed, we have the Farmers Branch Creek. This watershed is characterized by a highly developed area in the upper portions of the watershed, shown here in red. Then we have the lower portions of the watershed, which are mostly residential, the green areas over here. Notice also the shape of this watershed. It is quite narrow, which combined with the highly impervious areas upstream results in very quick responses to rainfall events. Now, Here is our project site, and which is located way downstream in the watershed. So this kind of starts to give you a hint about why we had some problems in this area. Let's zoom in again and get really close to the actual segment of the creek where the action took place. Okay, so this aerial imagery shows the conditions on the project site prior to October of 2018. Notice that we have 3 dam structures and that this is a ponded section of the creek controlled primarily by dam number 3 here to the left. Now, notice very carefully how this landscape is going to change as we go into our next slide. Well, you see that now we have only 1 dam. The other ones failed, and during the events that hit the area in October of 2018, these rainfall events were the triggers for the emergency that we will describe in more detail as we continue in this presentation. So to have a better understanding of what happened in the area, I will show you a sequence of key events that started in September of 2018. In this picture, you can see dam number 3, which evidently was already in bad shape. And we had raised a flag previously about this dam being at a potential risk of failing. So let's start the sequence here. Notice that the storm of September 22nd over here, you can see, recorded almost 8 inches of rain in 24 hours. That was a very significant event, but the dams did not fail during that event. They actually failed during the following week after a much smaller storm. So we believe that the first storm was the one that weakened the already damaged dam, and then it simply could not hold any longer and failed during the smaller storm event that followed. Immediately after the failures, we had another significant storm which exacerbated the emergency situation. You can see here on the top right picture how dam number 3 simply crumbled. And we also see the erosion, significant erosion starting to occur in the banks and next to the creek. As a result of this situation, the city requested Freese and Nichols to perform an emergency risk assessment in the area. As part of that assessment, we identified 4 main issues of concern. The first was the area around dam number 3, which is identified here as this location 1. This area was experiencing severe erosion along the banks of the creek, and residents were rapidly losing their backyards. So this was something of concern. The dam itself represented a risk to the public and it needed to be removed. The second issue was a very aggressive head cut that was rapidly moving upstream. In this schematic, you can see here, we show the location of the head cut on October 11th, this first location here. And then 2 weeks after that, on October 25th, over here, basically it moved to 125 feet in 2 weeks, so very rapidly migrating upstream. Then as we continue visiting the site, we could clearly see that the head cut was migrating rapidly, and this became a major driver for the design effort. The third issue was this area that you see here right at the edge of this property. We had a severe erosion problem in this area, and it was putting a portion of this property at risk of falling into the creek. As part of this effort, we drafted a letter to the property owner explaining the situation, and we recommended that they stay away from that side of the property. And Scott will show you some pictures of this area later on in the presentation, so you can see the problem and the situation that they were facing. Finally, we identified a sanitary sewer line, which you can see over here in this area. This line crosses under the creek, and at the time when we did the assessment, the head cut was still far downstream. However, we knew that we had to arrest the head cut before it could put the sewer line at risk of failure. So the next portion of the sequence of events is the temporary repairs that the city implemented. Basically, these repairs were simply intended to stop the bleeding, if you will, and buy time to design a more permanent long-term solution. So these were in place by February of 2019. After those temporary repairs, Fries and Nichols started the brainstorming process for the potential long-term design solutions. But the pressure was on. We kept getting more and more rain, and the residents continued to put pressure on the city as they started to realize that the temporary repairs were not going to be sufficient to protect their properties. You can see here that during this 10-month period between August of 2018 and May of 2019, the total accumulated rainfall was almost 64 inches, well over the normal annual rainfall of 38 inches for this area. And then during the month of April, funds became available. On May 1st, Fries and Nichols started to design the different aspects of the improvements. And first of all, that grade control structure, which was primarily intended to arrest the head cut. We completed that design in only 10 days. And by mid-May, DCI, our contractor, began construction of the project. However, in May 18, as you can see here, we had another storm event that caused dam number 1 to partially fail. The only dam that was remaining, and you'll see pictures of this later on in the presentation. So after this occurrence, then we had to put on hold the construction of the grade control structure, and switch gears to designing another emergency solution that would prevent this dam number 1 from a complete failure at this other location upstream. So with this, I'm going to stop and turn it over to Scott, who's going to continue the story and give you more details about the design and construction of the emergency solutions. So Scott, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, David. My name's Scott Hubley. I'm the North Texas Stormwater Group Manager for Fries and Nichols, and I led the design phase for this project. I'm going to talk about the design and construction of these emergency solutions as we worked with the city and the contractor to respond to this dynamic situation last summer. The first element I'm going to talk about is sheet pile grade control structure. This was the highest priority element because it was meant to stop the head cut. We knew that as the head cut continued to progress, it could cause additional damage to public property and to private property. And that was our highest priority. You can see this is a drawing we put together to depict the grade control structure. It consists of sheet piles with rock riprap. The rock riprap served two purposes. One was a plunge basin to stop erosion on the downstream side of the grade control structure. The second was to provide stability to the sheet piles. The contractor had 20-foot sheet piles on hand. It was going to take some time for them to get 30-foot sheets and equipment. They didn't have equipment on site that could drive 30-foot sheets. So we worked with them. We came up with a solution that if we had the grouted rock riprap on the downstream side, it could bolster the sheets and provide the stability we needed so that we could work with 20-foot sheets and also provide that erosion protection for the plunge basin. We had rock riprap on the leading edge up on the upstream face of the drop structure to prevent any scouring on the upstream side. Here's a picture of the sheet piles during construction. You'll notice they're keyed into the bank on both sides. You can see the head cut has worked its way up to that location. And upstream, there was a sewer line that we were wanting to protect. We knew if the head cut made it up there, it could cause that sewer line to fail and really add additional layers of difficulty to an already challenging situation. I want you to notice this roadway on the running through the site that the contractor had constructed, this access road through the channel. While we were building the sheets to stop the head cut, there was a dam. We had a storm event, and there was a dam about 200 or 300 feet upstream that failed. And the only way to access that site was through this existing channel access ramp and temporary roadway that had been constructed to facilitate the sheet piles. So we had to pause work on the sheet piles, move upstream and work on that dam, and then come back and finish the sheet piles. So we'll talk about that in a minute. I just wanted to point out that picture here. Here's a picture of the sheet piles from above. You can see how they're keyed into the bank. I want to pause here and just comment on why we chose sheet piles as this emergency solution. There was two key factors. One was time, and the second was weather. So time, we wanted something that could be installed quickly. The sheets can go quickly. We knew that the site is changing every day. Every time we have a rain event, that head cut moves, and we didn't have time to do a lengthy dewatering process or structural forming. We needed something to go quickly. Weather is really closely related to that. As it was raining and continuing to rain, the site was very wet, and we needed something that could be done in the wet conditions. Whereas a cast in place structure or something like that, where we need to do extensive dewatering, was not really feasible given the time durations we were working under. There was a little bit of concern from the residents about the aesthetics of the sheet pile, but we were able to, through our public outreach and discussions with them, they understood that primary erosion, or the primary concern was stopping the erosion. They were definitely more concerned about losing their property than they were the aesthetics of the solution. And it was pretty clear that you can come back and dress these up later. And I think they were pretty happy with the end product. So this is the dam that failed, just a few hundred feet upstream. You'll see on the left, we had a storm event that took out a good chunk of the abutment, pretty good void under there. City crews got out there and put some sandbags out to keep the water off of the failed area. On the right, you see, looking downstream from the dam, it took out a concrete bag wall, a couple of trees, private improvements, including this patio. So the property owner was very interested in getting this repaired. The city also, though, because we knew if we had another storm event, we're going to lose this whole dam, and we'll be dealing with the same situation we were downstream. We're going to have that same thing upstream. And so it was decided pretty quickly we need to try to repair this dam and save it. This was the solution. Just a couple weeks later, we had design and we're constructing a solution. We had flowable fill being placed in the void in the dam. We installed additional sheets to stop any erosion from undermining the dam. We installed these offset. You'll notice from the existing apron, the spillway right here, we wanted to install the sheets offset so that any subsurface flow beneath the spillway could have a place to be relieved. So these rocks were not grouted. They were empty so that any subsurface flow could make it under the dam and vent out here. We didn't want to float the dam by cutting it off with these sheet piles. We have additional rock downstream to serve as erosion protection, and then shored up these abutments with rock as well. So you'll notice the dam failed on May 19th, and by June 4th, they were almost done with the repairs. That included having to build the road up here, dewater so they could place some of this, get shoring in place so they could do the work. So the contractor really worked a lot of miracles to make this happen. So after that was done, we went back downstream and finished the sheet pile structure. You'll see a picture of it here later in June, completed on the left. It's got the cap in place. All the grouted rock has been placed. We placed rock between the sewer line and the grade control structure. On the right, you'll notice a picture of this structure in operation during a storm event that we had a few months later. So we've had a number of storm events since then. It continues to operate as it intended. It's had no further damage in this area, and residents in the city are quite pleased. So after we dealt with those two, it was time to move on to the bank stabilization and repair the damage that was done by the head cut. So on the top left here, you'll see there's a tributary that was coming in that had a concrete apron that was undermined, that was failing, needed to be replaced. On the top right, we had a residential structure. The bank had failed and was within a few feet of the building. Bottom left, you see the culprit there. That's the actual head cut. You can see how dynamic and unstable this site was. And really where that head cut was helped us determine where the sheet pile needed to be and also the extent of the bank stabilization. So this is a plan view showing the bank stabilization. The solution here was a modular block wall, had rock riprap toe protection in front of it to protect against scour. Above, on the upper parts of the wall, we had mechanically stabilized earth, MSC bank stabilization to provide a green element. Here's some pictures of the final product. See on the left, you can see the MSC is all the grass sloped areas. You can see the grade control structure at the upper end, the flume for surface drainage. Here's a picture in the middle with it during operation. We've got the native seeding coming in this photo. And then on the right, you can see that we're able to protect the house with the retaining walls and the riprap toe. They were quite pleased when the project was done. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up and let David talk about long-term solutions.
All right, thank you, Scott. So the story does not end with the construction of the improvement that Scott just described. While this design construction effort was ongoing, the City Council requested Freese & Nichols to prepare some conceptual long-term solutions that would incorporate the elements that were being built at the time as part of the emergency repairs. So we came together and prepared 3 concepts and presented them to City Council for their consideration. To help guide the decision for a long-term solution, each concept was evaluated based on these criteria: scope of work, project cost, implementation time, environmental permitting requirements, maintenance requirements, and the associated flooding and erosion risks. So the first option was to build a new dam at the same location and with the same height as dam number 3, kind of replacing the dam that failed downstream. Notice that we also included some additional bank stabilization components into this solution. This option was basically a request from the residents. Some of them wanted to restore the original conditions of this area and create a ponded section of the creek once again. Our second option is similar to the previous one, but the new dam would not be as high as the original. It's kind of a middle ground type of solution here. This concept also included some step pools to serve as grade control and bank stabilization features as part of the solution. Finally, the third option basically represents a stable stream concept. There are no new dams in this option, only bank stabilization improvements that would complement the work that was already ongoing. The City Council did not make any final decision really at that time regarding these alternatives, and basically decided to wait. And now that we have some of these elements already in place, and the city and the residents have seen that they are working properly, basically what they have decided is to monitor the conditions in the area to determine later on if further actions are needed. So really this is in their court right now. They have these options, they have all the information they need, but for now they're just waiting and seeing if there's really a need to go beyond what has been done so far. Before we move into our Q&A session, I just wanted to highlight that this project was featured on the June 2020 issue of the American Public Works Association Reporter. The project also won the APWA Texas Chapter Project of the Year Award under the Disaster or Emergency Construction Repairs category for projects under $2 million.
All right, that was a good video. I wanted to take a look back and understand why the structure failed. Why did Dam 3 fail? And let's talk about the orientation. As you'll notice, the orientation is not perpendicular to flow as we would expect. It's possible the stream changed pattern over the time frame of the structure, but it's also possible that the orientation of the structure is purposeful and that it was placed in such a way to direct flow away from a bank or maybe away from some type of utility or structure. Now, the orientation and the location of the structure on the meander did not help provide stability for the dam. So geomorphology is looking at what happened, right? So using aerial photography, we know that between December of 2015 and April 2016, we see improvements to the left bank looking downstream of the dam, as shown here with the arrow. This would make sense because it is on the outside of a meander bend where high energy is located and would be erosive in an unstable section as outlined here in yellow. So now let's look at an aerial from March of 2018. We see that the erosion located on the right bank, again, looking downstream. Throughout this time, the left bank improvements have continued on the structure, but this aerial is of importance because it's the last photo we have before the actual failure. And notice, as shown here with the arrow, the downstream end of the dam has completely failed due to undercutting. Also, what is not necessarily shown as clearly in this particular aerial is that in red, there's a large amount of erosion on the right bank. All right, so here's the failure. So using the channel evolution model. So what's going on here is downcutting and widening is occurring downstream of the dam. And as shown in the previous slide, portions of the dam along the right side had collapsed and until there was a failure. And this failure could be attributed to the bank or maybe a piece of concrete of the existing Dam 3 structure finally coming loose. But either way, there was a complete failure as the water or flow circumvented the structure completely. Again, because there was improvements on the left bank, the flow was focused solely to the right bank. And this really didn't help as we saw the storm events that came through and finally caused the complete failure and the massive erosion. And the head cuts were then allowed to migrate upstream quickly. So from a geomorphic channel evolution model perspective, this channel is a type 2, as you see in the upper left corner, because the head cut, it's migrating its way through this section. Another observation here is the channel bottom bed material. As you see, there are some rock and coarse material remaining. Now, this dam has been ponding water for quite a long time, but you don't see any type of clays or silts, the fine material, they're all gone. They've all worked their way downstream, propagating geometry changes as it moves through the system. So now that Dam 3 is not holding the grade anymore, the downcutting is expected to migrate upstream towards dams 2 and 1. In the upper left picture, we show the collection, the data collection that we were doing after the dam had failed, but it also shows in that picture the head cutting migrating. As mentioned in the pre-recording, the head cut had migrated 125 feet in 2 weeks. So that's a very fast moving head cut. So during the geomorphic analysis, the potential for downcutting was determined for the reach. To do this, we found the nearest downstream hardpoint, which are typically road crossings, which hold the channel flow line and stops instabilities from migrating. In our case, Denton Road, approximately 2,500 linear feet downstream of Dam 3. Thinking about Lane's relationship, we're locking in the slope and we are not expecting additional downcutting. A stable slope for this channel was then extended up to our project area, and it was determined that approximately 8 feet of further down cutting would have been expected. Knowing the expected down cutting helps us quantify the expected damages upstream if the down cutting were to occur, but it also helps us determine the embedment depth of the proposed grade control structures to provide protection. Shown on the profile here, the dam 3 is no longer there, holding back the slope, and the head cut migrating upstream is well defined. The area outlined in red hatch is the expected future down cutting, while the channel moves from a type 2 degradation to a type 3 widening situation. Now that we have a better understanding of the instability in the project area, we can place the protection to stop the migration of the head cut and protect existing infrastructure. So shown here in green is where the drop structure was placed to protect infrastructure and structures surrounding our project area. So the drop structure provides channel stabilization from the head cut migrating. However, widening is still a possibility within the project site. Therefore, we need to provide bank protection. And it's provided here as shown in the form of rock riprap. And you can see here the structure again under normal flow conditions, and then structure under some type of storm event acting in appropriately. Additional bank protection was provided downstream of the drop structure, which protected the drop structure and structures within the vicinity. This is a temporary solution. However, the design still needed to account for head cut migration upstream and protecting of the tributaries because we did not want the instabilities to propagate. As shown, riprap was provided to stabilize the tributaries, and the wall was keyed deep enough to account for additional head cutting that was going to migrate its way up to our structure. So here are some pictures of the completed downstream protection. As you see, the lower left, the system conveys flow as designed. We use geomorphic principles to help aid the protection of the reach after dam 3 failed. However, it's important to note that this is an engineered section with modular block and riprap protection. Not all geomorphic processes are applicable here. Although this section is not completely natural, it fits within the geomorphic system because concepts like Lane's relationship and the channel evolution model were considered in its design. So with that, we'll open up with any type of questions.